Hello people, today we're going to take a deep look at iterators in JavaScript. Starting off, what is iteration? The dictionary definition is to repeat something, and in a programming context, if you had an array with lots of values and you wanted to do something repeatedly to each of those values, like printing them out, then you could say that you were iterating over that array. Now that's a technical definition, but how does it work specifically with JavaScript? The JavaScript definition for an iterator is any object with a next method, where that next method returns an object with two properties. One is called value and the other is called done. So the value property contains the next value in the sequence. So in an array, it would return the next value in the array, and the done property is going to return false until the last value in the sequence. So in an array, once the array has been ended, then the done property is going to return true. So this will tell JavaScript, we've gone through all the values in the sequence, the iteration is done, so you can stop calling the next method. Now that's an iterator. An iterable in JavaScript is a bit more complicated, but it's still related. In a moment, we're going to go through an example, which is going to give some context. But for now, an iterable is any object that contains a Symbol.iterator property. And the corresponding value of this property is a function that when called returns an iterator, which allows you to iterate over the iterable. Yep, I know how that sounds. Now that's the theory done, but how can this actually be useful? So every time you try and iterate over an object, JavaScript will check if it's an iterable by checking for the Symbol.iterator property. Now some JavaScript types, like arrays and strings, already have default implementations of the Symbol.iterator property, which is why for those types, you can use spread operators and for of loops, which rely on the returned iterator to work. But not all types have default implementation. So some types, like a custom object you might create, won't have a default implementation of the Symbol.iterator property. So for those types, if you wanted to iterate over your own custom object, then you would need to implement your own system.iterator property, which would then let you iterate over that object with a for of loop. All of that means you can define a Symbol.iterator property for a custom object and make it iterable. Now finally, it's example time. Like I said, to make an object iterable, you have to define a Symbol.iterator property, which is equal to a function which when called returns an iterator, which is an object with a next method which returns an object with value and done properties. Simple. I'm going to take us really slowly through this example, and if I lose you at any point, you can just rewatch this bit. First thing we're going to do, very simple, we're going to create an object called iterable and we're going to put something in it. Let's give it a property called property. Now because we're trying to make this object an iterable, the next step is to add another property called Symbol.iterator. Now this has to be in the square brackets. Next, we're going to make Symbol.iterator equal to a function. And from here, inside that function, we can run any code we want. For the sake of this example, we're going to create a variable called C standing for counter and make it equal to -1. You'll see why in a minute. And we're going to create a simple array counting from 1 to 5. Now at this point, we're going to add our return value for our Symbol.iterator property. Remember, Symbol.iterator returns an iterable. And an iterable is just an object which contains a next method. So taking that one step at a time, we're just going to return an object. And then inside this object, we're going to add our next method. So at this point, Symbol.iterator is returning an iterable. Well, kind of. We still need to implement our next method. So that's what we'll do next. The next method needs to return an object of its own, and that object must contain a value property and a done property. So we're going to make our value property make a call to our array defined above with our counter ++ inside the square brackets. And yes, you can totally do that with arrays. So you can call a value from an array while also incrementing your counter at the same time. So for the done property, we're going to create a conditional where it returns true once I is equal to array.length. Since arrays start at 0, once you reach the 5th index for a 5-value array, you're not going to have any values to return. So at that point, iteration will be done and we're going to stop calling our next method. Now at this point, we're going to console.log an array, and inside that array, we're going to use the spread operator and then our iterable object. This will log out 1 to 5. Since spread operators only work with iterables, the only reason this worked is because we've implemented the Symbol.iterator property. Now this is the most convoluted, overly complex way to log out 1 to 5, which is all well and good. But what's the real life use case? Where can this actually be useful? I mean, the first use case is generators, but since that's my next video, I'm gonna say no more here. Generators are cool though, stay tuned. Now the second use case for iterators is iterating over custom data structures. So JavaScript doesn't support data structures like trees, but you can quite easily implement your own. Maybe I'll cover these in some future video. In any case, if you want to iterate over your own custom data structures, you need to implement Symbol.iterator. And the best thing about it is, because you're implementing the iteration yourself, you can decide exactly how you're going to be iterating. So in the case of a tree, instead of going breadth first, you could go depth first. Well, that's iterators covered. Next video is generators, which are closely linked, so stay tuned.